I think we're going to be getting started. Hello, everyone. My name is Kat Marriott. I'm the Marketing Communication Coordinator at CISCRP, and I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Building Patient-Centric Trials and Putting the Patient First. We have two distinguished presenters with us today, Danique Anderson from CISCRP and Helena Baker from Medical Research Network. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items to cover. Everyone has been placed on mute upon entry, and I would ask that you please remain on mute for the duration of the call to avoid noise disturbances. Please use the chat feature to the right of the presentation screen to submit any questions. You may send your questions in at any point, and we will address them at the end during the Q&A session. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available for archive viewing in the CISCRP website. You will receive instructions after the webinar for how to access and view the recording. For today's agenda, we'll go over welcome and introductions, the need for at-home trials and nurse care, home trials supporting drives patient-centricity, and then followed by the Q&A session. So without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce you to our first presenter, Danique Anderson. Danique, I'll pass the baton over to you.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you so much for making the time to join us today. It's my pleasure to be here along with Helena. I'm the Director of Research Services here at CISCRP, and it's my pleasure to speak to you today, if you don't mind moving along to the next slide, about the current state and the challenges with the traditional clinical trial model, and really providing the point of view from the patient perspective, and talk about some ideas on ways to minimize the burden of clinical trial participation and positively impact enrollment and retention, and with our ultimate goal of accelerating drugs to market. And obviously, you know, one option we're going to be speaking about today is in-home trials and nursing visits, clinical trial visits and nursing visits, but obviously it's really important to emphasize that options are critically important, and there's really no one-size-fits-all. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I wanted to kickstart by speaking to some trends in clinical trial design, and this is a study that Tufts conducted a while back, looking at different types of metrics and just trying to emphasize a bit on how clinical trial designs have changed, particularly in 5-year increments. And you'll see that we're collecting a lot more endpoint data. Our eligibility criteria number has increased significantly as well. We're collecting, we're doing more procedures and having more visits. And certainly the scope of the trial and the size of trials has certainly increased across in the past 5 years as well. And in particular, to try to spread the risk and try to address some of those common enrollment challenges, you know, the number of sites as well as the number of countries that are involved have increased. And some of the drivers for these complexities have included, you know, scientific advances, you know, gaining a better understanding of the underlying causes of diseases. So we're collecting more data, you know, ensuring patient safety. And in different countries, there's certainly different regional variances in standard of care, which has led to, again, collecting more data and making these trials more complex. And certainly in these times, the impact of technology, we're collecting more and more data on top of everything else as well. So if we can move to the next slide. So these complexities have translated, and again, this is probably something that's very familiar to you all, into significant enrollment, retention, and compliance challenges as well. So 50% fail to enroll a single patient or under-enroll of clinical trial sites, and the average dropout rate is about 30% across clinical trials. And again, thinking about all the extra data that we're collecting, and also looking at the number of inclusion-exclusion criteria, particularly as these clinical trials are moving from, you know, very large general population trials to more targeted populations. So I think I hear an echo. If we could just mute everyone again, I think that might be helpful. Yeah. And hopefully everyone can still hear me now. So again, and again, with the influx of technology, wearables, sensors, we're collecting even more data, and we're asking patients and study volunteers to do even more, not only in the actual physical study clinic, but also at home. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a few statistics from our Perceptions and Insights study, and this is an online study that CISCRP conducts every 2 years. And it's really in an effort to gauge public and patient perceptions about clinical research, but it also has a section on clinical study volunteer experiences. And we're actually, in fact, in the process of launching and collecting data for our 2019 study. But this is a very large study that we typically conduct among 12,000 responses in 2017, and we're hoping to replicate that in this year. So like I mentioned, we collect data on clinical trial experiences as part of this study. And what I've shown here is some, I think I hear a lot of background noise. Okay, that's better. So the first top part here is showing data about patients that were eligible and qualified to join a study, but after reviewing the informed consent form, they decided not to join. And what I wanted to highlight here is you'll see there's a lot of logistical issues. So too many study visits was one of the reasons why, and too many medical procedures were some of the reasons why they decided not to participate. On the bottom half, you'll see this is data from those that actually participated in a clinical trial, and we are looking at their top dislikes after they finish their participation. And you'll see, again, a lot of logistical issues here. The location of the study clinic is a big one. The overall time commitment and the visits being too time-consuming are also top dislikes. And again, this is something that's that we hear often in our patient advisory board work that we do. Traveling to a study clinic is very burdensome to patients, particularly if they work full-time, if they have children, having childcare. And again, it just speaks to how having options and the option of having clinical trial visits in the home can alleviate some of this burden. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as part of this study, we also collected some data on the type of study medication that was administered, and how easy or difficult it was to administer, and how easy or difficult it was to understand the instructions. And you'll see, obviously, again, on top of everything else that we're asking study volunteers to do at home, obviously one of the more important ones is making sure they're compliant with their study medication, particularly if they have to take it at home. And you'll see on the left, the bottle medication was perceived to be the easiest to take next to blister packets, but as the administration gets more complex, obviously the instructions get more complex. So again, just highlighting having a nurse assisting the study volunteer or caregiver at home can really help increase compliance. And again, we hear often in our patient advisory board program that, having someone show you in person how to do this or how to take a particular medication or how to do something is very, very effective and helpful. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So what's really important when it comes to patient and families during home visits? And what have we learned from patients and their families, in terms of what's critical during these home visits? And this data actually comes from a patient advisory board that meeting that we conducted among patients that have had some of these home clinical trial visits. And so we talked to them a little bit about their experiences, and we're just highlighting a few of the key themes here. And I think, probably relationships is probably critical. That personal relationship they have with that nurse, that study coordinator that comes to their home is really, really critical. And we hear it often also, particularly during regular clinic visits, at a physical site, you know, that relationship they have with the study staff member really helps shape their clinical trial experiences. So having a nurse that has and can develop that personal connection with the patient is really important. I mean, we heard somebody that this particular nurse had baked cookies for this particular patient and their family, and it was just something that was really touching for them and really helped shape a positive experience. So a little gesture like that makes a huge difference. We also heard having consistent staff is incredibly important as well.
Can you see the screen?
Again, making sure that they are able to consistently see the same person, and again, it helps to build that rapport, build that relationship, and build a level of comfort, particularly in someone's home. Again, making sure that this person that comes to their home is highly skilled, particularly at blood draws, which is obviously something that they're going to be doing often, because there was one instance where they were watching this person, you know, do a blood draw, and they felt that that person wasn't necessarily highly skilled at it, and it just made them question the overall quality of the service. Making sure that the home nurse has sufficient support. You know, a lot of times they have to bring in a lot of equipment, and the patients and their families often feel compelled to help them, but they know that they are not able to help them. So making sure that the nurse that comes to the home is properly supported is also critically important. If we can move on to the next slide.
Hi, Anik. I think we're just going to pause for a minute. We're going to see if we can share the content a bit differently. We're seeing that a few people can't see.
Oh, okay, sure.
So just bear with us for a moment, everyone. Apologize. And Anik, are you able to see where we're leaving off?
Yes, we are at the right slide. Oh, go back one. Yeah.
Yeah.
And hopefully everyone can see now. If you, okay, perfect.
Very
Glad
good.
everybody can see now. It sounds like everybody can see. So what have we learned from patients and again, you know, it may seem intuitive, but these are really important aspects to, particularly from a patient and caregiver point of view. You know, acknowledging that you're going into somebody's home, it's important to establish those ground rules for the study staff before they enter a home, and you know, really making sure that it's making themselves sparse and you know, making it a comfortable experience for someone, and respecting that they're in someone's home at the same time as well. Ideally, we heard a preference for having a single study doctor, and particularly as we move to more of these, you know, telemedicine, virtual study visits type formats, it's really important to people and to patients and caregivers to really have, ideally, a single study doctor to interact with throughout the study. But if that's not possible and there's multiple doctors, particularly if they were going to interact with them on a, you know, via video conferencing or things of that nature, having the opportunity to meet the whole team in advance, and that way everybody gets to know each other, and the patients and their families know that everybody's working together to coordinate their care, and that there's no unfamiliar faces. And so that was very important. Also, the opportunity to have the storing supplies in the home. You know, if there's room, patients in study and family members were open to that if the space was available. And again, it would help to, if it helps to cut down on the amount of time that the nurse or the nurse would have to spend in the home versus bringing all the equipment in, you know, that's definitely something that would help. And also getting the pre-approvals that are required to minimize the wait times that, you know, either the nurse has to wait in someone's home, and obviously making sure that we, again, minimize the overall time that the nurse spends at someone's home. And again, you know, and before I hand it over to Helena, I just want to emphasize again, you know, not everybody is comfortable with someone, you know, coming to their home for a clinical trial visit. So as with anything else, it's important to offer different options for people as they're entering into a clinical trial. So Helena, I will turn it over to you, and I think we can move on to the next slide.
Thank you, Anik. That was great, and it's lovely to be able to look at the different options. Just to introduce myself, my name is Helena Baker, and I am a oncology nurse, a research nurse. I head up nursing services here at the MRN, but I've been working in nursing and in clinical trials for the last 34 years. I'm aging myself to say, and being able to reduce patient burden in all aspects of their care is something that I have felt passionately about for many years. I think it's really important to pick up on one of the things that Anik said just now, that one style of service or treatment or management does not fit everybody. Now at the MRN, our focus is on our focus of patient centricity is to offer home trial support visits, so seeing patients in their home rather than then coming back to site for every single visit. But we have to recognise, of course, that it's not a panacea. Some patients, their disease state may prohibit that. They may value going back to the site. It may be that they're just too unstable. There's a host of reasons why home trial support might not be appropriate for them. But what's really important is that however we support the patients, it's about focusing on them. So that could be seeing them in an infusion clinic closer to home. It could be seeing them in their physician's office closer to home. It could be providing patient concierge services, so there's travel support services that allow them to feel less of a burden. But everything is about bringing the trial to the patient rather than making the patient flex around the trial. If we can go to the next slide, please. So why is patient centricity important? It's a phrase, a term that's being bandied around a huge amount at the moment. But Craig Bradley, who's a brand manager at Shire, earlier this year, he published a paper called The Importance of Patient Engagement in Pharma Field. And he said, for 2019, the trend of patient engagement is only likely to become more important, with the continued desire for the patient to be involved in their own care. And that is so true. We all can see now that patients more than ever now know about their conditions, about their treatment options available to them. And so by involving patients in their protocol creation, that automatically leads to the development of trials that are less burdensome on patients and their caregivers, that are easier to recruit patients onto, and are more successful at retaining patients through the duration of the study. It's all about creating trials with the patient in mind. Next slide, please, Leslie. So again, I ask again, why is patient centricity important? And as I've already stated, one obvious way of focusing on patient centricity as far as the MRN is concerned is to offer home trial support. And we've got two studies here that were done over the last 10 years. 15 years. One of them is Jonathan Chataway, that was published in the Lancet Neurology, and that was on patients who had multiple sclerosis. They've relapsed and we're requiring consecutive days IV steroid infusions to manage their relapses. And the study concluded that the clinical outcomes were the same or better in the group treated at home, with no difference in safety, and that the cost of treatment in the home was the same or cheaper. And then Alex Malasiotis in 2009, he compared home support and hospital support, outpatient hospital support, in patients receiving oral chemotherapy who had colorectal and breast cancer. And he concluded that significant improvements were observed in the home care group with various clinical parameters, and that the unplanned service utilisation, particularly in the number of inpatient days, that's the rescue visits and the rescue inpatient stays that were required, were lower in the home care group. So we can see that the focus has to be on supporting the patient wherever that patient is treated, be that in the home or in the hospital or in a local clinic to them or in their physician's office or wherever that happens to be. And it's very clear that when the focus shifts from the patient to the scientific questions in the trial, which is very easy to do, that's where things can start to go wrong. If you move to the next slide, please. So this is a patient story. I've got a couple of patient stories here for you, and this first one is about Miranda. Miranda was a 35-year-old lady with metastatic breast cancer, and she was on her third-line treatment. Miranda had failed on her 2 previous therapies and chemotherapy regimes, and had the choice, therefore, to enter either into a clinical trial at a large national teaching hospital that was 2 hours away from her home, or to opt for the standard available therapy, which was gemcitabine and carboplatin. Now, Miranda opted for the trial because she felt that she was giving herself and her young son, who was only 5 at the time, the best chance of her being able to extend her life and to maintain her quality of life for as long as possible. But it just didn't happen like that. Miranda felt that the site staff were not interested in her as a patient, as a person. They weren't interested in her symptoms beyond her breast cancer. And that can so easily happen when you're trying to recruit into a difficult study to get into. You're completely focused on the trial, the scientific questions that are being asked, the endpoints that you're trying to reach, the eligibility criteria, and everything else about that patient can very easily get forgotten. And with these patients, you know, Miranda had metastatic breast cancer. She had lots of other issues. She had bone mets, she had brain mets. There were lots of other things that were going on in her body and in her life. And that just was not supported or managed or recognized at the site. Added to that was a very high study burden with her being required to be at the hospital 3 days out of 5 for several weeks at a time. It all meant that she just ended up withdrawing from the study. And the site lost a really valuable patient with really valuable data. And Miranda lost an opportunity to extend her life. She ended up going with the gem carbo, and unfortunately she died a few months later. And that's just a really sad example of where clinical trials can lose that focus on the patient. Next slide, please. So, how do you ensure that trials are accessible? How do you ensure that you design your study with the patient in mind? And it's not easy, but thinking about the visit schedule is probably one of the absolute best things that you can do. Think about what needs to be done and try and get some of those big things, some of those invasive procedures, try and get them done as much as possible at the same time. So getting the MRIs, the CT scans, the physical exams where they have to be examined by the PI, get them done as much as possible at the same time. So bundle those activities and procedures, leaving the ECGs, the bloods, the PK bloods, the IMP administration visits, you know, be that infusion or sub-Q injection or whatever that may be. They can all be done at home, freeing up your site's time to be able to, so that they can focus on the big visits and leaving the smaller visits to be done in the home. Think about the lab samples that you require. You know, do you really need those samples to be taken every week? We've got patients who are on study for 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Do you really need the bloods taken with that frequency? Do you really need to have those samples, those lab samples, refrigerated, centrifuged? One of the banes of my life is being asked to do refrigerated centrifuging in the patient's home. We carry centrifuges into the patient's home, but a refrigerated centrifuge is something like 70 kilos. And I have yet to find a nurse big enough and strong enough to be able to lug one of those into the patient's home. So we do have workarounds, of course. You know, you can absolutely put samples on wet ice and then cool them down before spinning. So there are workarounds, but think about what you really, really need to be done and what is possibly best left to happen in the site. And then the other big thing is physician oversight. Physician oversight has been a hot potato for a long time now. Thinking about, does the patient really need to be seen by the PI at every visit, or if they don't need to be, then those visits might be suitable for treating either in the home or in a local infusion clinic or in the physician's office, for example. Next slide, please. So what can you do in the home? There's a very quick, easy answer to this, and it's in that red box at the bottom. It's following the general rule of thumb that anything a nurse can do independently with equipment that he or she can carry can pretty much be done in the home. We do an assessment to ensure that what we're being asked to do is safe. We manage risk assessments and things like that, but there is pretty much everything that a nurse can carry and can do independently can be done in the home. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So what are the benefits of home visits? And indeed, what are the benefits of visits not necessarily taking place in the site, but taking place more local to the patient's home? It's about having convenient, tailored care for the patient and for their families. It's reducing their travel burden. It's ensuring that they're not having to take time off work. It's ensuring that their families don't have to take time off work. When a visit can be done in the home or in a local office to the patient, rather than having to travel sometimes hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to their site, all that will help to reduce the travel burden and the time that they are spending being involved in the study. And it enables patients who otherwise would never be able to take part in a study to actually join and have the same opportunities as those patients who are living right next door to their study site. The other thing, of course, is that for a patient, just being able to have few site visits, few visits to the hospital means it's just like having a comparative standard of care treatment with the additional benefits of being involved in a clinical trial as well. So it's a win-win for the families and for the patients. Next slide, please. What about for the research site? I think, again, I have not met a site yet who does not want to do the absolute very best for their patients. And again, being able to offer them convenient, tailored care for patients, I think makes a huge has a huge advantage. It's lessening the burden on the site staff as well, who are run off their feet. We all know that sites are running multiple studies at any given time. And if you can reduce their burden by taking some of those visits out to the home, then it gives them the time to concentrate on seeing the patients that really need to be seen in the site. They're more likely to improve their site performance as well, because patients are more likely to say yes, they'll take part, and critically, they're more likely to say yes, they'll stay on study as well. So the site is going to do better and potentially then improve their revenue as well. And finally, you're opening up more patients to the site as well, because patients who have less issues with travelling from far afield and are more likely to say yes, they'll take part. I think the other thing to think about with sites is the impact on pharmacy as well. Pharmacies are having to manage increasingly complicated biological substances, and they all require cold chain storage and cold chain expertise, and that has an enormous resource and space impact on pharmacies. Some of the UK hospitals that I've worked in, the pharmacy departments are in the bowels of the hospital, underneath the steam pipes, and they really struggle with some of that that time and space available. And so passing that out to a central pharmacy or to a local infusion clinic, or storing the drug in the patient's home under cold chain expertise and control, that can make a huge difference for the pharmacy teams as well. Next slide, please. As we move finally, and most importantly, onto the sponsors and the CROs, so the people who are actually controlling the money and controlling the drug. Again, I don't know any sponsors who are not focused on ensuring that they provide convenient, tailored care for their patients. And of course, there are huge advantages as well with focusing on patient centricity, because you're going to get much more in the way of enhanced drug compliance. Patients are much more likely to stay on study when they enroll in a study where they've got local support. We run at an average of 95% patient retention on our studies, and that is over studies that are running over from anything between 2 weeks and 5, 6, 7, 8 years. In fact, we've got patients who are still on studies, and they started with us in 2008, and they are still on study 11 years on. And the only reason these patients come off study is because they have disease progression or the study terminates. When you're supporting them in a truly patient-focused and patient-centric manner, then they have no reason to drop off otherwise. Of course, we've already talked about the larger pool of patients, because patients are better able to access clinical trials if they have either home or local support, and therefore you're going to see an increase in patient enrollment, and we see an increase in enrollment of 60% on average. There is, of course, an advantage as over the competing trials. All the big sites that we've worked with over the years, they all have competing studies going on. And if you can offer local support, home-tailored or local support, or patient travel services or whatever, then you have a significant advantage over some of those other competing studies. And of course, your ultimate aim is to get that product to market faster and to start getting some revenue on the study after having spent out for so long. So we'll move on to the last slide from me, please, Leslie. And that is to finish on a high note with Simon. Simon was an absolutely wonderful 15-year-old. He was on a study with patients with Morquio syndrome, which is a rare metabolic and lysosomal disorder. He had enrolled in a study that required him to have weekly infusions that lasted 5 hours at a time, and that study lasted a year. And there's a part of you that thinks, oh, holy Hannah, how on earth are we going to be able to get patients to stay on study for that length of time? And not only that, they're teenagers. Simon, along with the other study participants, were referred to the MRM for home trial support. The nurse who was going to be supporting him in the home, she and her backup nurse went to the site and met Simon and his family at the site so that they could be introduced and you could get a smooth transition of care from the site to the home. And he then continued to have his weekly 5-hour infusions and delivery of drug to his home under cold chain conditions, and that lasted for a year. I am delighted to be able to say that Simon completed the study with absolutely no missed visits. He had 52 infusions lasting 5 hours. He even took his exams while he was receiving home trial support. So whilst his fellow students were in the exam hall, he had a nurse and a personal invigilator in a side room where he conducted his exams. He completed his exams with his infusion running, and he finished the study with no missed visits. 5 stars for everybody with that one, and he is now receiving home support to post-study through a commercial home care provider. It is a fantastic example of ensuring that the study comes to the patient, not making the patient flex around the study. It means that you can see patients in their workplace, you can see patients in their holiday homes, you can see patients in their schools, or indeed, as we've already said, in their local infusion clinics or in their physician offices or wherever. But the whole point is that patient centricity is about bringing the trial to the patient, not the other way around. And on which happy note, I will hand this back to Leslie and the team to say, would you like to share any questions?
Thank you, Helena, and thank you, Anik, also for your presentation. We can start our Q&A session now. So as a reminder, if you have any questions that you'd like Anik and Helena to address, you can just submit them in the chat box, which is right to the right of the presentation screen. We'll try to take questions in order as they're received. We also received some questions beforehand of the webinar, so I guess we'll start there. I guess the first question is, what is the uptake like from sponsors using this service?
Using the home trial support service?
Yes, exactly.
It's becoming increasingly popular, I have to say. We started this about 13 years ago, and it was a very slow process, getting people to trust us, really, and to believe that their data and their patients were safe in remote nurses' hands. And we have found that now we have multiple in the 50, 60, 70 requests for proposals a month now, as more and more sponsors and more CROs as well are opening their eyes and waking up to the fact that this can make a huge difference, not just to recruitment, but also to retention. So generally speaking, I think there's been a real upsurge in awareness and willingness and openness to the concept of home trial support and local support critically.
Great, thank you for answering that. Another question is, what about increasing participation in registries?
Anik, do you want to take that, or would you like me to take that?
If you don't mind tackling that one.
Absolutely. So absolutely, registries, funnily enough, we do very little in registries. When we first started, we did a few registries, and then it's really sort of flattened off. But we usually have one or two running in the background. But I think because registries, generally speaking, are not requiring much in the way of procedures to be done to the patient, then you don't tend to get a huge amount of requirement for home trial support. But whenever you are wanting to capture additional data, such as perhaps vital signs or ensuring that data is captured on a regular basis when you can't necessarily rely on it being captured in any other way, then home trial support or telephone support from nurses can be really, really valuable for registries. I can see a question here about if you wanted to assess the participant's experience following their involvement in a clinical study, what do you think the three most important questions would be to ask? Anik, I wonder whether you would be best placed to answer that, because it plays to your experiences with patient advisory boards.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we always recommend. Obviously, there's a couple of key questions. I think usually we start with like overall assessment of their experience overall. I guess also, how well did the experience match up with their expectations going in? In terms of maybe if you wanted to assess their experience in the home. Again, I think it's an assessment perhaps of the communication with the study staff, as well as the ability of the study staff to communicate their progress to the clinic itself, the physical study clinic, and making sure that the participant stays updated on their progress. You know, whether or not they would recommend, you know, participation to others or recommend a home service to others is also a great indicator on the overall quality of the service. So hopefully that answers the question. And I don't know if you had anything to add, Helena, to that.
I think you've covered the key things there, Anik, to be honest. So I think the critical one is, if you've done this, would you do it again, is the biggest single indicator of whether this has been a positive outcome or not, and a positive experience or not. I think, you know, how easy is it? How easy is it going to be for me as a patient to take part in this study? It's really, really important a question to ask. How much is it going to impact my life as a patient? How much is it going to impact my family's life? Is really important. And there are ways and means of dealing with that. I can see that there's a question about concierge support. What is offered when a patient's utilising this service? I think there are a number of organisations that do offer concierge support, and that could be, depending on the organisation, anything from travel scheduling service, so flight booking, taxi booking, train booking, that kind of thing, through to actually providing cars and transporting the patient to and from the site, or flying them. You know, we deal a huge amount with rare disease, where patients very often are having to travel right the way across country. So, you know, the example I always give is that we have a site in Atlanta and a patient in Wisconsin. It happens time and time again, and so these patients are having to fly. And again, you know, if home trial support is not an option for all or some of the visits, then make it easy for the patients and their families to get there. So make it easier to have prepaid transport, have either, as I say, a booking service, a scheduling logistics service, or actually be providing cars, taxis, etc., to enable them to take some of the stress out of the service.
Great.
Yeah,
good.
and I think this is another great question. At what point does a potential clinical trial patient find out about the home nursing option in a trial?
That's a really
yeah, and again, it's really important, and I'll let you speak to this as well, Helena. But I think, you know, it's really important. It's at the beginning, but it's really important to also be cognizant of the fact that, you know, in the beginning, especially if it's like a very serious condition that they have or anything like that, you know, and generally speaking, in addition to the overall informed consent process, it's just very overwhelming overall. And it's just important to keep that in mind when you inform them of this potential option. And Helena, I'm sure you can speak to some of your experiences here as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we train the sites on how to use the service, and so the patients won't hear about the service until the sites have been trained, and it's really important that the sites have a good understanding of how the service works. I think the question here about if they were informed of this option early in their search for clinical trials, would patients be more likely to join a trial? Do you know, that's a really interesting question. Anthony, I don't think anybody has ever asked me that before. It's the first time I've come across this. And I think that's a really fascinating question, and something that we should probably look into in more detail. I'm certainly going to pass that out to our teams to investigate that. You've asked how you can spearhead awareness to future patients that home nursing is an option. I think increased marketing awareness of options around patient centricity, of options not just around home nursing. It's important to recognise this, but around the support of patients locally. So be that in their in their local infusion clinic, as I say, or in their local hospital or in their local doctor's office. I think all the home care providers need to do more in terms of making this information more widely available to patients, but it's also quite challenging to ensure that the company the sponsor who is ultimately paying for this are happy to have every single patient offered home care. My immediate reaction is, well, why wouldn't you? But of course there is a cost involved, and Kevin has already asked twice about what are the costs of home care in clinical studies, and unfortunately there is very limited data available, because we only know the uptake in sites and studies where we are offering services. We don't necessarily know the sites in that study that aren't utilising home trial support, so we can't give you the true costs. And sponsors and CROs are understandably very resistant to share their overall study costs with us, but that's something that we are working on, trust me. But what we can see is that the more patients you have that come out to home trial support, the better your return on investment is. And if you start the study with the intention that the maximum number of patients come out to home trial support and the maximum number of countries and the maximum number of sites, then you get to you absolutely hit cost neutral, and there may even be a beneficial cost impact on the study. But the key is ensuring that you maximize that patient throughput through the home service, because if you set the service up and then don't push your site to use it, then the cost is significantly higher for you. And yes, Janet, we do offer nutrition support for cancer patients as well. How are we doing on time? We've got 11 minutes left, I think.
Okay. We have another question. What is your experience with patients consenting to this service?
Providing patients are told about it, and this is really key, so that the earlier question that came up about how early do patients get to hear about the opportunities for home trial support or local support in the study is really critical, because if they know about it, they tend to say yes, they'll take part. If they don't know about it, or if it's poorly explained to them, then they won't take part, because they're already accustomed to seeing their site. We know from Unique and CISCRP work that patients like to see the same person each time. They like to see the same medic, they like to see the same nurse, and that happens much more frequently with local or home support than it does in the site, just because of scheduling issues and the scheduling requirements. So if you can do that, and we can get that message across to the sites, who are able to then get that message across to the patients, then we know that patients are very willing and easy and happy to take up the offer. But it is all about educating the sites on how to educate the patients. And it's that communication flow. And of course, that begins right at the top with educating the sponsor, who educates the CRO, who educates the CRA, who educates the site, who educates the patient. And so it's a real communication flow, and there are gatekeepers at all those points in the flow, and opportunities for that message to get lost. So we're doing a lot of work on how we can improve that messaging and how we can make it more consistent throughout that communication flow. But it's a work in progress, as these things always are. In terms of the perception from the FDA, we have a very positive review from the FDA. We've been in MRN, certainly I can only speak for MRN, but we've been inspected twice by the MHRA, and we've done extremely well throughout. And I would expect our next inspection to be next year or the year after. And both sets of regulators take a very positive view towards home healthcare because they are very focused on reducing the burden of the patient. They often have questions, but we are always able to work with the sponsor and the CRO to ensure that those questions are answered effectively, and everybody seems to take a very, very positive view about it. I'm very happy to say we wouldn't be here otherwise. If they didn't like us, we wouldn't be doing it.
I think there was a question here also on how early in the drug development process do you see home trial support being used? Do you see it in phase 1 or phase 1B clinical trials?
Sure, Sarah, that's a really good question, and we see it right the way through. Actually, we started off with sort of later phase studies way back when, but I would say probably about 50% of our studies are early phase now. Generally speaking, our phase 1 and phase 1B studies tend to be blood draws, so doing PK bloods in those sort of 24-hour, 48-hour doses, 48 hours post-dose PK blood draws, but we increasingly do IMP administration in the home in early phase studies as well, phase 1, phase 1B studies, but that is only after significant safety discussions with the medical team within the sponsor and also with the PIs as well, so that we can be sure that that we are not exposing the patient, the sponsor, the CRO, the site, and indeed MRN to any risk. Do we have any other questions?
One more.
Yes, another question is, what is your perception with FDA support in home health nursing?
No, that one, yeah.
Again, that's been very positive.
Yeah.
We've had conversations in the past. Anik, I don't know whether you can speak to this as well, but certainly from our point of view, we've had conversations with the FDA in the past about appropriateness of treating patients with particular drugs or particular therapy areas, and it's always been very positive, and they've been very supportive of our activity.
Great. And one more question is this type of service better suited for certain patient populations over others?
That is such a good question. And you know what? I would have, a few years ago, I would have wholeheartedly said yes. We always used to feel that it was better suited to patients who were on long-term studies, who had lots of visits. There was a high visit burden. They were having repeated blood draws or lots and lots of IMP administration, or they were rare disease and they had long distances to travel. I've subsequently realized over the years that there isn't a patient alive, I think, and living and working and getting on with their lives that doesn't benefit from the opportunity to reach out to home trial support, because everybody, regardless of their circumstances, is living busy lives. And even if they, so many times I've had PIs say to me, oh, our patients don't need home care because they live right next door site, or, they live in the same city, they're very local. And you just kind of think, well, yeah, but they still have kids, they still have to arrange childcare cover, or they still have to get across town and find a parking space for prohibitive prices. They still have to get public transport or whatever. They still have their lives to lead. They still have side effects that they're really struggling to cope with, and they're much better off being able to vomit quietly in their own homes than have to do that on the public transport, and so why wouldn't anybody benefit from home trial support, whether their duration on the study is 2 weeks or 10 years?
So I think one more question, the regions that MRN services are available, you're pretty much global, correct?
We are everywhere but China.
Great. Thank you, Elena. We're just about at the end of our time, so we'll need to close the webinar, but I just want to remind everyone that we're going to be posting the recording of the webinar on our website, which is CISCRP.org, as well as sending out a link via email to everyone that attended. I'd like to thank today's speakers, Anik and Helena, for their presentation, and to thank Medical Research Network for co-hosting the webinar with us. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for joining today's webinar and sticking with us through our technological difficulties. And then I'll just hand it over to you, Anik and Helena, if you have any last comments.
Sure. Thank you, Kat. Well, thank you, everyone, for making the time today. I think certainly the Q&A session was actually quite interesting, and I just want to make sure to communicate that if you have any additional questions, please feel free to email them to Kat or CISCRP in general. We'd be happy to address them. But it's been our pleasure to be here today and talk through this this really important topic. And Helena, and our contact information is here in case you want to reach out to us directly. And Helena, did you have any final closing comments or thoughts?
I think you've just about said it all, Anik. I think it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. There's been great questions, and it's really been good to be able to engage with you this way. And as Anik has said, our contact details are there, so please do reach out to us. We would be really, really happy to talk to you at any time. Thank you very much indeed.